Awesome. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, it's so great to be here with you all today. I'm going to be talking about some work we're doing in my lab at UIUC. I'm a computer scientist and engineer by training, and I've been involved in some collaborations with developmental scientists over the past 10 years or so. And obviously, the topic of interest these days is AI, understanding how AI can be utilized in various settings. And I'll be talking about the use of AI to measure social behavior in children. And I want to start by just giving you a kind of a quick sense of where we are with AI as well and kind of how we got there. So I just want you to, oops, I just want you to take a look at this video. So this is a kind of typical thing that people are very interested in analyzing. There's an actor here who kind of accidentally drops a package. You've probably all used ChatGPT where you can type a text prompt and the AI answers your question. What's exciting in the last few years is the ability to have these models that will take a video like this as an input as well. So you pass in the video to the language model. We call it a vision language model because it has a video input as well as a query. And then you ask it, what happened in this video? And if you do this, this is an example from NVIDIA. This is a model that NVIDIA released maybe a year or so ago. And it's a fairly big model. It's got like 34 billion parameters, okay? And if you ask this question about this video, you get a reasonable answer. It says things about, workers and warehouses, but it doesn't mention the drop package, which is the most salient property of this video to people, maybe second only to the actor's inability to really sell this, drop convincingly. Okay, so then you might be wondering, well, does this AI model know about, packages and floors and things like that? And so you might ask it explicitly, did the worker drop any box? And the model says, yes, they did. So the model knew that this event happened in the video. It just didn't realize that was an important thing to mention. So emboldened by the success, you might then say, well, let's ask it, when did the worker drop the box? And the model comes back and says, in image number two, which is a pretty weird response given that this is a video and it's also just completely wrong. Okay. Um, and so it turns out if you train this model differently with some additional logic that's not in the original formulation, you can build a model that will answer this when question correctly. So if you do extra work on a question that you know is important, you can get the result. But of course, there's lots of videos in the world. There's lots of questions you might ask about videos. Okay, so this is an example that just illustrates a few things that we believe to be true of these AI models today. On the one hand, they're very powerful, and that's unquestionable. And in certain situations with certain inputs, they're as good as people are in answering certain kinds of questions, which is amazing and unprecedented. Okay. But they're also opaque. We don't really understand what it represents. We don't know what information the model is capable of, processing exactly. And they're also very brittle, meaning you might give the model a bunch of inputs and it gets them correct. And you give it more inputs of the same kind to humans, they're exactly the same type of thing, and it gets them wrong. And you don't know why did it get the one set right and the other set wrong. Okay. So this is the state of the art. Now, you might ask, could we please just fix these problems, make these models better in all these ways? And there's a multi-hundred billion dollar industry right now around the globe that's just racing, to address these challenges. Okay. So you can be sure that whatever problems we have today, they're going to get some set of them will be fixed, and then it'll get better over time. Okay. That's a given. So what I want to talk about today is actually a different set of questions, which is, how do we get here? So what is the kind of fundamental technology that underlies these models to give you at least a sense of what has happened in terms of these breakthroughs? And then the most important question I would say for us is how can we then harness these advances for developmental science? And that's really been the focus of my lab now for many years. So what would an AI model for developmental science look like? So this is just a conceptual picture. And I think you can easily imagine lots of things, along these lines. But for example, at least two properties would need to be true. So these models would need to take developmental samples, video, audio, et cetera, of children as input. And it would need to understand the content of those videos. It needs to understand what things are important and what things are not, so that when you ask a question, you get the right kind of answer. And then of course it needs to understand the question. So it needs to understand the terminology and the language of developmental science and clinical practice so that you can ask questions in a way that's natural to you as a researcher or as a provider. And then in this case, this little schematic, we're giving this model uh, repeated assessments of the same child, multiple video clips over time. And then the query is, how does the eye contact behavior of that child change over time? And then if this were actually a thing that existed, and if this worked the way it should, you might get some kind of graph like you see on the right that just shows the frequency of eye contact across sessions. Okay. So this is an idea of the kind of thing we'd like to build. And then figure out, hopefully in collaboration with a lot of folks on this call, figure out what this could really be useful for, how it would improve, let's say, research practices, how it would improve clinical practices. That's kind of the grand, goal that we're working towards. Okay, so how can we make progress? So I'm going to just talk about a really basic question, which is that if any model is going to do any kind of assessment of any kind of child-related condition, it has to understand the building blocks, that are being used. So in this case, we're talking about social communication. And so a basic thing you'd want these models to be able to do is to understand the building blocks of social communication, the utterances, the gaze, gesture behaviors, et cetera, all the tools with which a child may communicate. And so each of these are, fortunately for us as computer scientists, relatively well-defined constructs, documented in the literature nowadays, across many labs in the world, many examples of videos of children exhibiting these behaviors. And we just want to build AI models that can measure them accurately. So this is a measurement problem. Given a video like the one you see here, which is from a protocol called the ESCS, that many of you are probably familiar with, this model is just trying to predict where the child is looking. So it's just looking at the gaze behavior. That's it. And it's just trying to do that as accurately as possible across these kinds of videos. And you can see on the left all the properties we'd like our AI model to have, but I just want to hone in on two of them. The first one is reliability. The only way this technology will be useful is if it's as good as people. Because right now, the gold standard for these behaviors is human coding, as you know, and that's a technology or a process rather that can be made quite reliable if you're invest the effort into it, right? And so AI models need to be equally reliable, I would say. Otherwise, you're just never going to use them. You're never going to trust them. You're never going to use them. And then the second thing is robustness, which means both, the usual thing that the model shouldn't hallucinate and produce incorrect answers, but also it means that the model should, and these are kind of interrelated issues actually. The model needs to work across a wide range of scenarios. So we want this model to work for all the children of the world with all their variations in appearance and their cultural contexts that shape their communication. We'd like it to work across all the settings in which children are being assessed, classroom, home, school, et cetera. And then across all the different, protocols and procedures by which you elicit behavior, and then in support of all the tasks that developmental scientists would be interested in solving. So it's a large challenge, I would say, but I think we're in striking distance of it, because of the progress we've made in the technology. All right, so I'm going to then kind of take you on a little journey along this path, and I'm going to try to answer these three questions in this talk. So the first one is really wanting to look at nonverbal communication in these models. And I'm focusing on nonverbal for two reasons. One is that it's kind of what I do. I'm a computer vision guy, so the nonverbal stuff that you see in video is my bread and butter. But also, although the language piece, using AI to understand speech is by no means, a solved problem. It's very mature. You have Alexa devices in your homes probably, and you have Siri on your phone. And again, it's not perfect and it doesn't work nearly as well for children as it does for adults. Doesn't work nearly as well for children with developmental, speech-related issues as it does for typical children. So there are definitely still a lot of work to be done, but that's a technology that really has moved fast. And so I'm going to really focus on the other things that are also very important because as we know, social communication is an integration of modalities and a coordination of modalities, and you can't understand it completely unless you understand all the modalities that are being used. And so getting that comprehensive picture is really important. And the nonverbal piece is much less mature, as you'll see. So that's going to be a thing. And then I also want to just give you a sense of this thing that's called a foundation model, which is in the AI area. This is kind of the single biggest advance, I would say, of the past few years that I think has lots of implications for what we can do with AI. So I just want to give you a sense of what that term means and why it's so important. And then I'll end by giving you an example of integration of modalities. So in this case, it'll be vision, speech and language, combined, sorry, speech and video combined to understand social communication. And that's kind of our three key goals today. And I'm going to have time at the end, I'm sure, for questions, but if there are things people want to discuss in the middle of my talk, I don't mind if you interrupt me. Okay, so let's look at nonverbal. So I'm going to do this via two case studies. So one is eye contact and the other is gesture. So eye contact is the first thing we started working on when I began this journey, more than 10 years ago at this point. And I don't need to explain to you all why it's important or mention the fact that it's impaired in autism in various ways. And so it's a key thing you want to measure, and it's often a target of intervention as well. So it's just important, okay, as you know. And so this is the setup we use to collect data for eye contact. It's the SCS protocol across the tabletop interaction with the child and an examiner. And the examiner is wearing a pair of smart glasses. They're actually not that smart, but they have a camera right here in the bridge. So the camera is right here. And if the child looks at the examiner, looks to their face, they're looking right into the camera. If the child looks away, any place else in the room, they're looking away from the camera. So with this framing, we can set up a very simple, for a computer science perspective, problem of just look at the video, each frame one by one, and predict, is the child looking at the camera? Or are they looking somewhere else? And that becomes a detector for these moments of eye contact. So we collected a large data set. This is large means like 150 kids. So not super large, but reasonable. And then labeled them manually with our coders, frame by frame. Is the child making eye contact or not? The green examples are positive eye contact. The red examples are negative, no eye contact. Okay. And then we trained a model, which at the time this was a pretty advanced model. Now this is ancient history, like couldn't be older and more pathetic. But for this particular task, because it's so simple, this model actually works very well. And the way it works is you take a video frame, like I see on the left, you detect the child's face and extract it from the image. You pass the face into this what's called a deep model, called a ResNet 50. And then it goes through a series of transformations. Each of those little blocks is a transformation of the input to the output. And you start with pixels, and then you get a final result, which is whether or not there's eye contact. Okay. And this is how it works in practice. This is a test video, and green means detected eye contact, and red means no eye contact. And this is a typically developing boy that we brought into our lab in Atlanta when I used to be at Georgia Tech and collected his sample. And this is a boy with autism at Weill Cornell that we did in part with Steve's assistance. And he makes less eye contact in this case, but when he does, the algorithm is able to detect it reliably. Okay. And so, as I mentioned, a key issue here is the reliability. And I'm showing it to you in this picture, which is actually more of a computer science way of looking at the data. But essentially, this graph shows the precision and recall of our model. And each of those yellow dots is a rater, an expert rater actually, trained to reliability. And they're rating an additionally collected sample of validation of testing data to test this reliability of the model. And the spread of those yellow dots is the uncertainty or disagreement among the human annotators. Even humans aren't 100% in agreement about social behavior, as you all know. And so there's some spread there, some disagreement. And then the AI model is the green and the red diamond in the middle. So basically, the AI is right in the middle of these human experts as far as the decisions that it's making. And that means if you take out one of the yellow dots, one of the humans, replace it with an AI, the inter-rater reliability of that rating group doesn't change. So the AI is a rater as good as a human in terms of reliability. And that really is our goal. I think this is the best way to think about, an AI that's as good as a human. And we just want to do this for all the behaviors that matter. So we have highly reliable automatic methods for analyzing the behavior. And we published this method in a journal a few years ago. And at the time we published it, this was the first example actually of a nonverbal communication behavior that an AI could, analyze with human level accuracy. Now, one of the properties of this approach is the use of these wearable cameras, this glasses with a camera in the glasses. And I think this is a really important uh, detail to highlight because, fortunately, because of the consumer interest in augmented reality and the fact that these big companies like Meta are really pushing this, the platforms that are going to emerge are going to be very interesting. And so, the nice thing about this paradigm is that by wearing a camera and microphones, as I'll show you in another example, by wearing it on your head, you are just naturally bringing those sensors into these interactions in an appropriate way, meaning appropriate meaning that the AI can see the world through the eyes and through the ears of the person who wears the hardware. Okay. And if you want to build an AI that can understand communication, giving it that view, that what we call a first person view or egocentric view of what's happening is really valuable. Okay. And so if the tech companies succeed and consumers get excited about these things, then we will have platforms that are quite usable that provide this capability. And that could be, I think, really transformative for answering certain kinds of questions. Okay, so that's a piece. Okay, so I talked about eye contact, and I want to talk about gesture next. And you might be surprised that, computer scientists have been studying gesture for a long time, actually, for decades. But unfortunately, none of the data sets are good in the past. So these are some examples of some popular data sets for CS people to look at gesture. And when you look at this, you realize, wow, this is not social communication at all. There's no people except for the person doing the gesture, and sometimes you can't even see that person. And these were not really, collected for the purposes of this kind of audience. And so when we started to get into gesture and realized this, we realized we needed to collect our own data set, which we did. And so I'm going to describe briefly now a new data set that we just released in a paper this year, which is looking at just dictic gestures. There's 4 classes of those gestures, and I just want to go through them one by one so you can see what we mean by gesture. So here's an example of pointing. And then the way it works is there's this video clip that shows the gesture, and then we identify a keyframe where the gesture is like fully developed. Like in the case of pointing, it's where the finger is extended, the hand is extended. And then in that keyframe, we label the subject, who's performing the gesture. We label the target, who are they gesturing to or towards. And then the task then would be to analyze the video and identify these gestures, label them correctly as pointing, for example, and then also identify like who's doing it and who are they doing it to. Okay, so that's the task. And you'll notice these are all adult, samples. Like these are adults. These are videos we collected either in our lab. In this case, we collected this video in Atlanta, or there are videos from YouTube that we're working with. So this is not yet a developmental data set. We're actually working right now to get an annotated developmental data set. And of course, as you know, gestures are super hard to code, so it's not easy, but we're doing it anyway. And anyway, we know that for children, the gestures are much more challenging because they're not fully formed and there's more complexity in what you see. But nonetheless, I think we can work on it. So here's an example of showing. Again, this is a YouTube video here. And the same idea, you identify who's showing to whom. And then here's an example of giving. The child is giving a little object to the probably caregiver here. Same story. And then finally reaching, which is the last one that we're looking at. So this is not a super comprehensive characterization of gesture in communication, but it's the most basic foundational thing. And the main point is this is the first data set that's ever existed that had actually social gestures, annotated. So we're really in the beginning stages in computer science of understanding gesture the way folks like you would understand it. And this is just more examples of the kind of samples that are in our data set. Again, all adults doing things in, various social settings. Okay. And this is my student Shu Kao who did this work, and it appeared at a computer vision conference over the summer. So what would the tasks be in a data set like this? So one task is just find the gestures where they're occurring. And of course, gesture use is in general sparse in time. So you have a ESCS entire session, you might get a couple of gestures from a child that's using gesture to communicate. You might get more than that if the child is super, capable of using that modality. And so one of the basic challenges is just find the thing wherever it occurs. And then you want to label like, there's lots of movements of the hand and body in a video. So you want to say, well, these are the ones that are actually the dictic gestures and not some other thing that's not, not a communicative gesture like that. And then finally recognize what kind is it? Is it pointing? Is it reaching, etc. So I'm just going to take you through very quickly here the performance of modern AI models on these tasks. And my main point is going to be that they're not very good yet. So again, gesture is something that we can work on. I think we can make progress on it and imagine a future where it's working well, but it's not yet working well. And so the pattern here is going to be these tables that you see on the right. And this is what we do in AI. We make these tables, and then the black row is the best model, and then we compare it to other models. And so in this case, we're just publishing the data set, so we're not staking our claim on a particular approach. These are some state-of-the-art models that we tested, but none of them are working super well. So those numbers in black, if it's super accurate, they're 100%, 100, and you can see that they're very far from 100. So this is not yet close to being a solved problem. Second problem is on the left. Is there a social gesture? Meaning, if you find something that's in the video, is that thing a gesture or some other random movement of the body? That's actually not so bad. We're about 81% accuracy. So it's able to determine, oh, this is probably a dictic gesture and not, some other random thing. But then you ask it, well, what gesture is it? Is it reaching? Is it pointing? And there the accuracy again is quite poor at 40% or so. So better than chance, which would be 25%, because there's four possibilities. But much not usable, I would say. So that's where we are. I think it could be worse. Chance performance would be worse. And I think we can make it a lot better. But that's kind of where the technology is. Okay. So all of these examples have been taking, modern AI models and then manipulating them in various ways to get these specific models of social behaviors of various kinds. And I want to just kind of walk you through how that actually is working and what has, enabled us to have these successes, which again, I've been in this game for, almost 30 years at this point. I guess, yeah, actually 30 years at this point. And, I just would never have imagined, that things would be working as well as they are today. So it really is unprecedented, and the gains are absolutely real. So then how do we get there? So this is the main challenge we've been facing, okay, what's shown in this slide, which is we got this video clip of this child doing something. And the question is, how can we extract the useful information from these pixel values, from the pixels in the image? And you may understand that a single pixel is really useless. Like it tells you almost nothing. And even a set of pixels that are close together in an image, if you just look at them, as data, for example, they're also pretty useless. So the challenge with images, and this is true for lots of complex modalities of data, you can't get the meaning unless you interpret the whole thing holistically. You have to analyze the whole image, all the pixel patterns, and then through that global kind of analysis, you can gradually figure out, oh, something's happening here, and you can predict it. So it's clear that the image itself is not a very useful representation of the data. You need to get it into some form that's more useful. And we have a procedure for doing that, and then some things that scaffold on that. And it's really these three big ideas that you see on the slide that explain, I would say, AI advances, like what's happened to advance AI. And I just want to walk you through them one by one to give you a sense of what's going on. So the most important idea is the one here, which is that the image is not very useful on its own. We need to take the image and map it into a representation which is more useful. And the way we think about that is there's this block that's called an image encoder. It takes the image as an input. It applies lots of transformations in a series, like you saw in that previous slide. And the output of those transformations is not an answer, but rather another vector, just a set of numbers, typically some thousands of numbers. And this vector of numbers is called a feature representation, and it encodes in those numbers the information in that image much more effectively than the pixels did, originally. So that couple thousand numbers, in contrast to the millions of pixels in a typical image, is a distilled, informative representation of the information that the image contains. Having obtained this, we can then do the kind of things you would normally do with data. Like you could cluster, for example, these vectors, and then if the representation is meaningful, you would expect that the clusters you get are actually meaningful. They relate to the content of the video. Now, clustering is this data analysis technique you might have seen where you ask the algorithm that does clustering, you ask it to group together the vectors that are similar, okay? And then this is a visualization here of a clustering result. And the challenge, of course, is these clusters are in a multi-thousand dimensional vector space, which humans can't actually conceptualize at all in a useful way. But these models can, work in that space. And then you can project that down to an image and make a visualization of that clustering. And that's what I'm showing you here. This is actually just a fake example, but to illustrate the point. So what does this all mean? So I give this model a bunch of examples of the child looking at the toy, and there's something about the face, the angle of the face, the toy, that means you're looking at the toy. And if this representation is good, all the toy looks would kind of cluster together, as you see in this little red cluster in this diagram. Then if I give the model a bunch of examples of looking at the poster on the wall, the head is different now, the gaze target is a different location. And now the vectors that correspond to poster looking would cluster into a different part of that space because they're similar to each other and not very similar to looking at the toy. Okay, and then likewise, we keep going, do all kinds of clustering. And then once we've got a representation that has pretty effective, capturing of the meaning of the input, We can also interrogate the representation and ask it questions. We can say, what's the child looking at? And the answer would come out correctly because the representation is correct. So a big challenge then, you can argue it's the only real challenge, is how to get these representations and how to get them, effectively, meaning representation is good, and then also efficiently, meaning that it's scalable and can work, for millions and millions of examples. And so the key thing, of course, is learning these representations. You can't design the encoder by hand. We tried doing that actually for about 15 years, and it didn't work. And then once we tried learning it from data, it worked. So that's an existence proof that learning is needed. And so how do you do it? So the earliest way to do this was an approach that's called supervised learning. And all that means is you give the model lots of examples and you label each one. So you say, hey, here's what it looks like when the child is looking at the poster. Here's what it looks like when the child is looking at the toy. And you just give it lots and lots of these labeled examples. And the label tells the algorithm, oh, the label is what's special about that example. And it uses that label to then organize the representation appropriately. So again, the things that are similar cluster together, the things that are different cluster apart. Okay. And this approach was very successful. And our first eye contact model that we ever produced used this approach. And our subsequent ones used it too, actually. But this approach has some problems, which is that it requires all the labels. And when you get to a certain scale, when you need, massive amounts of data for a problem, you're not going to be able to get that many labels. It's just not practical, particularly for developmental science, where the labels are, kids doing something, which is very hard won, kind of data. So fortunately, people invented a different paradigm, which is called self-supervised learning. And it seems almost magical, and I'm not going to be able to really explain this to you in the time I have, but the idea is that you can actually build an effective representation without the labels. It turns out you can exploit the structure within a set of images themselves without any label information. And by exploiting that structure, you can learn a representation, which turns out to be very effective. Okay. And so then this procedure of what's called self-supervised learning allowed us to scale up the data we process because we no longer need to label the examples. We just need to have them. And that's a much easier problem than labeling them. But one disadvantage we still have with this approach is that for each of these tasks, like understand the gaze behavior, we build a single model. So then for gaze, gesture, etc., you'd need different models, one for each of them. And that's not ideal because, each of these models is going to be trained on the same videos because the same videos contain all the modalities because the child is using them seamlessly. And so you might ask, could we get away from this, each task is a separate model kind of thing, and, just have one model that does everything, okay? And that's the big idea that's called the foundation model. And the way you get there is simply by taking the same approach I already mentioned, self-supervised learning, and just scaling it up. So rather than just having the developmental samples, those videos of kids, and just working with those, you throw in all the videos you can find of all kinds of social interactions, and then other kinds of videos as well. So you just give this model exposure to just, hundreds and hundreds of millions of examples. And it turns out if you do that and you get enough data in there, then the model begins to represent the domain of the data itself. It begins to understand things about video in general. And it's very flexible once it gets to that point. And then when the model is very flexible like that, when the representation is both powerful and flexible, then the same representation can be used to answer lots of different questions. So we can ask the thing about toys, about gaze behavior, rather. That's one task. We can then ask the same representation about gesture behavior. We can ask the same representation about, facial affect. And so this single image encoder is actually doing the work for all the tasks. And then you just need one model that does everything. And once you got this representation that's so powerful, then you can interrogate it for a bunch of questions, at the same time. What about this, this, this? And it'll answer all of them. Okay. And so that's the basic idea behind what's called foundation models. And it's been a tremendous revolution. And it's only like 2 years old or 3 years old. So it's really new. But all the, the GPT, those kind of chat agents you're using, those are all foundation models. And we have some provision as well. And I'll show you one now. Okay, so by the way, this foundation model, it doesn't exist right now. The one that solves all the developmental tasks, that doesn't exist yet. We're trying to build it. Okay, but vision foundation models do exist. So this is a good one, quite popular, called Dino V2. It's not actually a very large model. It's only 1 billion parameters. The one I showed you earlier is 34 billion. And that's not a big model either nowadays. 100 billion is like a decent sized model. And the data that was used is massive. You can see the number of images here, more than 700 million. And then it costs $10 million to train it. So no university is going to do that work. But fortunately, the AI companies are doing that work. And so far, they're making their models available to us for free or behind some paywall, which is not great, but you can still access the model in other ways. And so this ecosystem right now of what are called open models, like this one, you can just download it from the internet. Just you do whatever you like with it. And then closed models, like the ChatGPT, for example, these are the world we live in, and it is producing very powerful models that are getting better and better with every month, actually. So it's a very exciting time to be in this space. So what does this powerful vision model do? Well, basically, it can answer a variety of different tasks with one representation. So at the top, you see an image, and this is a task called depth estimation, which means given that picture, you want to predict how far away from the camera are each of the pixels, okay? And so the wall behind the couch is the farthest away from the camera, so it's dark purple. The table there in front of the couch is the closest, and that's why it's yellow, it's bright. So this model has a pretty good sense of how the depths are distributed in the scene based just on a single image, which is a remarkable capability, like a remarkable feat that again none of us would have thought that was possible, even 15, 20 years ago. And then it can solve a very different problem actually with the same representation, which is what we call semantic segmentation, which is just label the pixels based on the kind of object they come from. So all the sofa pixels are in light blue because the model knows these are all the same object and it knows the name. It's a sofa. And then the pillows are in yellow because the model knows these are a different kind of object. They're called pillows, but it knows all those pixels come from the pillows. And so it colors them all yellow. So these are different tasks, but the model is able to do all of them with one representation. So then, given that this exists, and we care about not these tasks actually, but social communication, you might ask, could these models be used to measure nonverbal communication through video? Okay. And it's not a trivial question because the people that designed this model had these kind of tasks in mind when they built it. And they weren't thinking about developmental tasks. They probably don't really care about kids. And so you have to ask yourself, like, can this be used in a setting like that? Okay, so here's the task we're gonna attempt to solve using this approach, and it's a complement to the eye contact task. It means in this case, the task is given your social partner, just predict where he or she is looking. Okay, so now you're not interested in looks to me, you're interested in where else is my partner allocating their gaze. And obviously, to understand the social situation and navigate in that situation, you need to understand both what's being directed towards me and understand where your social partner is allocating their attention. And that's comprehensive understanding is part of your foundation for social communication. So in this example, the green box, which we call a bounding box, that denotes the subject of interest, the woman in the top row. And the output of the algorithm is that green dot that says, where is she looking? And then the algorithm has to handle cases like the second image where you can't tell where she's looking because she's looking off camera. In this case, maybe she's making eye contact or in general looking somewhere else. Okay. And we can repeat the analysis for the man. So we can do this for every person in the image. And then we get a comprehensive picture of where people are allocating their attention over time. So more formally, the task is given an image, given this bounding box, produce a heat map that shows where the attention is likely to have been allocated. And the data to train this model is the usual human expert judgment. We ask people, where do you think the child is looking? And they click, 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 where they think that the gaze might be allocated. And that's the data that we use for this model development. So if you then look at this, and by the way, this problem has been studied a lot in computer science, going back to like 2017. And my lab has made a number of contributions to this problem historically, including one of the widely used data sets to measure performance in this task. And there's lots of experience now that suggests that there's all these different cues that can be used by these models to make these kind of gaze predictions. And so the question my student Fiona asked maybe a year or two ago is like, since these cues are pretty well aligned with what vision models like DynamoV2, what they can do, could we use DynamoV2 to solve this problem? Well, with all this buildup, of course, the answer has to be yes, right? And the answer is yes. So this is her paper that appeared again at the same vision conference this summer. And this is an example of using an existing commercial foundation model from an AI company to solve a developmental task. Okay. And I'll get to why I think this is exciting in just a second. So the way to think about this is, again, the image comes in on the left side. There's this encoder I talked about. And now that an encoder is this DynamoV2 thing, it produces that feature vector that you see there that's labeled linear for some reason. And that's the feature vector that we're talking about. And then all the logic to the right is what Fiona invented. And it's this logic that takes that representation and decodes it and turns it into a heat map for gaze, for visual attention. Okay. That's the part that she innovated, and that didn't exist before. And it turns out that how you do that matters a lot. So if you don't design that correctly, it doesn't work at all. Even though you got this really powerful encoder, that's not sufficient. You have to actually figure out how to use it. And that was her accomplishment. It was quite an impressive achievement, I would say. And so here's the performance as a table. Again, this is our bread and butter in computer science. The bottom row is our model, and then all the numbers are more or less all the numbers are in bold, and that means we're the best performance, and we have to beat all the other people in the table. Otherwise, our paper doesn't get into the conference. And then next year there'll be some paper that has their method at the bottom, and they're beating us in some way. And that's how the ecosystem, works. But I want to draw your attention not to the accuracy here, but rather to this first column, which is the number of learnable parameters. And that means these are the set of numbers whose values need to be specified for this model to work. And they're going to be specified by learning them from data, as I was describing to you. And the key property of our approach is we have an order of magnitude less parameters than our competition. All the models above us have, tens of millions of parameters, and we have around 3 million parameters. And that's because we're leveraging this Dynamo V2, which is a billion parameters, but it doesn't count because we're not having to train that. We just download it from the internet and use it exactly as it is. So we don't need to use any developmental data from kids to train that model. We just take it and use it. And all the developmental data is being used to train that decoder on the right that Fiona invented. And because it's leveraging this powerful representation, we don't need very much data. And this might seem like a nerdy, CS thing, like, okay, how much data, blah, blah, blah. But it actually matters a lot because the data is going to ultimately be the difference between the model working and not working. And as we said, like in developmental science, the data is really hard won. So anything that can cut down on the amount of data is a huge advantage. And order of magnitude is a huge difference. So I think this is really a significant step forward from that perspective. And this is how well it works in practice on a testing set. That was a mistake right there. So the model missed the side eye. That's not yet in its repertoire of gaze behaviors, perhaps. So it's not yet human level accuracy. We don't know actually how close it is to human level accuracy because we haven't done all the work yet, but we'll get there. So it's working pretty well. And then I want to show you some developmental results. These are new results, not published yet. This is the same kind of ESCS settings, but now with this new model, and it's working pretty well in these examples. You'll see a gaze shift in a second. There you go. So it's able to do this. And then this is the BOSC, which I'm sure you know about Kathy Lord's instrument for detecting change over time. And it's actually doing pretty well in the BOSC. It gets the bubbles, which I was pretty surprised by actually. So I think this is pretty promising in terms of understanding what the trial is doing. Again, these are just single examples I picked, so don't draw any strong conclusion from this, but as we work on this more, I think it'll get better and better, and I do think it'll become a useful instrument at some point. All right, I want to end by talking about integration modality as I go a little quicker through this, so we can get to the end and have some discussion. So, popping up a level, let's say, from the basic building blocks of social communication, there are things we'd like to understand, like, who's talking to who's listening to who, the more comprehensive portrait of the interaction that defines a social interaction. This is some work we did with Meta in a group that we've been collaborating with for a long time, led by Vamsi Ithapu at Meta. And so the way I think about it is these people are interacting, and then sometimes they're looking at you, talking to you, listening to you. Sometimes they're talking and listening to each other. And we'd like to just build a comprehensive picture of this scenario. So for each person, we'd like to know who are they listening to, who are they talking to, and you can build this graph where all the pairwise, edges are person A is talking or listening to person B. Okay, and then we can factorize this graph into the egocentric part directed toward the glasses wearer and the part that's your social partners. Okay, and again, there's going to be a wearable rig here that's collecting all the video and audio in this case as well. So here's the definition of the problem. You got an audio video recording. It's a video from the wearable camera plus a microphone array. So we have a spatialized audio on this device that Meta built that is measuring the sound coming in from different directions. And then you process that with a model, and the output is a graph that changes over time that shows you who's speaking to who and who's listening to who. Okay. And there's this complicated architecture that my student Wenxi invented that solves this problem. And the main thing is that this model integrates audio and video together into a single representation, and that's how I can solve the problem. Okay, so it's got audio encoding as well as video encoding, and that's a very popular and attractive thing people are doing these days. And we're beating our competition. Don't worry about that too much. And then I wanted to show you the result. So I'll first play a really short clip of the interaction, and then I'll show you the result in terms of the algorithm's analysis of what's happening.
For us to do. Actually, we
Okay, so that was an example of how this interaction is going as far as audio and video. And then I'll show you the result. So in the middle is the prediction of our algorithm, and on the right is the ground truth. And then when the two graphs look the same, the model is doing it perfectly. Whenever there's a difference in the two graphs, the model is making a mistake. Okay. And so it's, it's more or less working. It's not perfect. It's actually really hard to tell in these cases what's happening. So it's very challenging to assess the performance, but I would say it's promising. This was actually the first work to do this that was published. So it's a very new area without a lot of progress yet, but I think it's quite attractive. All right, so I'm just going to wrap things up. So I talked to you about capabilities of these modern AI models enabled in their ability to measure different social behaviors. Talked about foundation models, which have really changed the game for how we think about data, in particular in AI. And then talked about the fact that we can integrate modalities like vision and audio and video together to begin to move towards a multimodal representation of communication, which has to be the ultimate goal, obviously, is to combine all the modalities because that's what the kiddos are doing. So I want to end by just talking about what's going to happen next, I hope, and share a little bit of thoughts on that, and then I'll stop. So I already talked about, this, kind of vision language model for social communication. I hope we can build this thing. We should build this thing. Okay. And then there's another important piece, which is the evaluation piece. So this model is only going to be trusted if it's evaluated effectively. And this is actually non-trivial to do this. And so the way we're currently thinking about this is actually building a capability for evaluating these AI models. And the idea is there's going to be this evaluation engine, and you'll be able to give it an AI model, and it will test that model against a battery of tasks, a battery of tests. And the tests are going to be defined by this comprehensive evaluation data set that we're trying to put together now with a lot of collaborators around the world. And this is going to be a private repository of videos. These will never be released ever on the outside. And the people that build these models will not be able to access this data set. So this is purely for testing purposes. It's completely hidden, okay? And that's good for two reasons. It means the companies can't cheat by training on it, which they would do accidentally if the data was on the internet. And then, it's easier for folks to contribute data if they know that it's never going to see the light of day, anywhere else except this server, which is a HIPAA protected, blah, blah, blah. And then there's this consortium that we're building, which are going to be experts like you all that help us figure out what videos we should have, what should be in this data set, what's the high priority things to get in there, what are things that may come later and we'll work on it later kind of thing. And then there's all the people around the world with developmental data. We're trying to get them to work with us and find some way to get their data into our data set so we can do this comprehensive evaluation. And the output of this process will be a public leaderboard. It'll be a website. You go there, it'll list all the models that are available right now from AI vendors, from public repositories that you can download, and there'll be that's the columns, okay? And then the rows are going to be all the tasks you might care about, every developmental task that a developmental scientist would care about. So it's going to be thousands of tasks when this is all complete. And what you'll know is for each row, it tells you for that task, how good are the AI models, okay? And if we did a good job building this benchmarking data set, then over time, the community will trust these numbers because they'll try it out and they'll say if the model is like 90% accuracy. They'll try it on their sample. Yeah, it's like 90%. So, it's right. And then this is going to be the measure that will guide you as far as when is it time to use AI. So if you care about something and all the world's models are operating at 40%, you can be like, whew, no need to work on that right now. Let's keep doing what I'm doing already. But then if it gets to like 90%, 100%, you're like, whoa, I need to start using this stuff. So hopefully it'll really guide the people that are going to consume this technology in making informed choices. Okay, so this is an unfunded little dream that we have with a small set of collaborators, and I would love to include, many people on this call that want to be involved in getting this thing set up. All right, and I'll stop there and thank all of our sponsors and just actually some of our collaborators. And then happy to take your questions.
Again, whenever I hear this talk, it just fires so much of my imagination, and you and I have talked a lot. So what I want to do is put it out to the audience. If you have a specific question for Jim or comment, or anything else, please raise your hand in your whatever reaction and take your picture, going turn your camera on, and we'll happy to have you entertain the question. But again, this stuff just feels like science fiction in so many ways. And I think what I appreciate the most is this marrying of expertise across technologists like yourself, and clinicians like us, and how we can put it out there. So in the absence of a specific question, I do want people to answer the question I'm about to give you in the chat. Yeah, this isn't specific to Jim's work, but if you had one area that you want AI to help you the most in your clinical work, what would it be? Can you put that into chat for me? Triage, Carrie says. Now, Carrie can't be the only person who has an idea about how AI can help you clinically. I know many of you, I know your names who are on this call and heard you talk. So anybody else have an idea? Report writing,
Yeah.
how to quicken an assessment?
Yeah. These are
Yeah, I think
great examples.
Ron and Carrie's answer are kind of married and adjacent to each other. If you can shorten triage, you can do a better, more focused assessment. Reliability and training, upcoming. Jim, can I just like build on what Elizabeth said?
Sure.
I don't know, Elizabeth, I think it was Rachel. One of the flips of this, which my colleague Courtney and I talks about, is like, how can we use AI not to solve our problems in terms of diagnosing autism, but what are your thoughts about using AI to train
Yeah.
clinicians and students? Can you
I think
speak?
it's super interesting. And I will say that, we are not working on diagnosing autism in my lab for lots of reasons. Okay. That's probably very clear to you all. And I think it really is the challenge is to develop these tools in a way that they are actually meeting, the clinical needs, right? And that's the really hard problem. And if you look online, you can find all kinds of random AI work by computer scientists about development and autism. And a lot of that work is really bad, actually. And it's because it wasn't developed in a context of a true collaboration. So that's really the big challenge we face is working together to find the right problems and then get the AI to work well enough on those problems that it's actually useful. And of course, understand how to get it translated into practice because obviously tons of barriers there that need to get overcome before you could actually use it. And that's really the road ahead of us is all that heavy lifting. But I do think the training is interesting because I think, obviously the model can be trained to produce a variety of outputs and it's automated, which means you don't need an expert sitting there with the trainee. The trainee can practice, on some repository of videos or something, and then get that feedback from the model about what it thinks is going on. And then that's just like self-practice. And then of course the expert is still needed because there's still going to be clinical judgment. AI is not going to have that, but at least it gives it some framing of some of the core constructs and what those look like, and then the extra part on top of that is what you guys would add. But then you just add the part where you really, the part that's really hard to automate is what you'd be adding rather than, what is a gesture, what is a look. I mean, I'm just making this stuff up because I'm not a clinician, but you understand what I'm saying. So yeah, I think it's a really great application. All these are great, actually. I just like to get like 20 PhD students with, tons of funding and then work with you all on all these
Yeah, I
problems.
said we got lots of work for you to do if you want it.
Yeah.
There are many
Yeah.
really, really good ideas in the chat. A lot of people had talked about like how can we apply these AI tools to response to intervention and treatment parts. How can we help it sift through differential diagnoses, not just diagnose autism?
Right.
How can you give meaningful feedback to clinicians about what's working in a treatment session so AI can watch and summarize and talk about that? Or like you were just talking about and what Rachel was talking about, like using AI to help us focus on specific key behaviors or whatever it might be if AI is that good at it. So,
Will this chat actually be saved? Do you know?
Courtney Fish, is this chat can be saved?
Yes, the chat will be saved in the AI recording that will go out.
It's funny. I've given this talk a few times, and Steve, this is the first time that anybody asked this question the way you did, and this is actually very useful to me. Like, I want to just make like a histogram, show my students, hey, these are the things that expert clinicians need. This is what we should be working on. I mean, we need to find the collaborators. That's the key part. We can't do it ourselves. Every one of these things is going to require some dedicated collaboration. That's the tricky part.
Jamie,
Oh, Jamie's here. Wow. Okay.
Jamie,
Yes.
that would be frightening to have a robot that looks like you. I mean, there could only be one Jamie McPartland. I
Yeah.
can't imagine what a robot looking like you would do holding me. So,
But the meaning thing, yeah,
that's an interesting
I'd
idea.
use that, you know.
Yeah, very, very good.
So,
So, my God.
okay, now it's getting personal.
Well, there's this thing that's, well, I have the floor right now, and that would be unfair to Jamie to slam his delusional quality, so I won't do that. Um, Thank you all. Jim, thank you so much. Again, I hope you guys see why I wanted Jim to come and give a talk. This is the future. It's something that's coming no matter what. It would be great if we had a seat at the table because there are many non-clinicians who are deciding for us what AI should be doing and helping us. And my reaction is to be like, that's not going to help me. What's going to help me is X. So yeah, so the chat that you've just seen and others and any Jim is one of the most gracious collaborators as well. So if you guys have ideas, stay involved. More to come on this. I really encourage you to, yeah, like Jamie just said, like you just have a way of presenting this stuff that most of our eyes cross in a way that's really accessible and exciting and inspiring, I should say. So thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, lovely to have a chance to talk to you all. And again, I really hope that we can find a way to work together on some of these problems. And I'm really open. So, just reach out or work through Steve. We'll be talking more, I think.
And this is going to be recorded on our website so people can rewatch it, send it to your students. Again, I would encourage you the third week of December, Matt Goodwin's coming to talk about wearables. It's adjacent to this talk and kind of builds on it in many ways. So please join us on the December one as well. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your month. And we'll see you guys next month. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.